Good morning, folks. Thank you all so much for coming out to this special live Q&A with Dr. Mike Daley here at our new virtual edition of Curious Minds. My name's Will Denovi. I'm the special programs curator here at Hot Docs, and I'm really excited that you could join us this morning to hear Dr. Daley answer your questions about his wonderful lecture on Oscar Peterson that was recently posted for Hot Docs members on our Hot Docs at Home platform. Before I hand our virtual stage over to Mike, I want to remind you all that we've just launched 4 exciting new Curious Minds courses that are now available for registration on our website. This includes a hotly anticipated new series on the folk music revival of the 1950s and 60s, led by none other than Dr. Mike Daley. So we are going to be posting these new video lectures on our website every Monday starting May the 18th. And then we'll be holding a live Q&A just like this one every Friday morning, in which you'll have the chance to gather online with your Curious Minds friends and hear Mike and our other lecturers answer the best questions that you've submitted to them in response to that week's lecture. And that is exactly what Mike is going to do right now. In response to his wonderful presentation on Oscar Peterson, we've received lots of great questions from you, our Curious Minds community, and Mike is going to run through them over the next 20 minutes or so. I'd like to close now by thanking our friends at Hollywood Suite for their support of Curious Minds. I want to thank you, our cinema members, for all you're doing right now to support Hot Docs and its charitable initiatives during these difficult times. And last but certainly not least, I want to ask you all to join me in raising your coffee mugs to the rafters and giving your warmest Curious Minds welcome to one of Canada's finest musical scholars, a Curious Minds favorite, Dr. Mike Daley.
Thank you, Will. Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are holding up well, staying safe, staying healthy during this very strange time. I'm very happy to be able to speak to you and to be able to share what I have learned about both folk music in the upcoming series, which is open for registration, and in this one-off talk about Oscar Peterson. By the way, I just want to mention before we get into questions that I was interviewed earlier this week by former Ontario Premier Bob Rae for his podcast called Political Stripes. And we didn't talk about politics at all. We talked mostly about Oscar Peterson, who was a friend of Bob's in Oscar's later years, and so we talked about that, and we talked about some of my musical lectures and so on. And so I would ask you to head over there, and let's see, Political Stripes is at politicalstripes.ca. How easy is that? All right, so I have some questions that were submitted, and I'll get to as many of those as I can. And one question is, what prompted Oscar to move to Toronto when his friend Oliver Jones remained in Montreal and was able to have a flourishing career there? Now, as far as I can ascertain, Oscar moved to Toronto in 1954 for a couple of reasons. One was that Toronto had a thriving jazz club scene at that time. And if you look in the newspapers, and by the way, I'll mention that a background to all of this is that I have a special interest in the musical history of Toronto because I'm writing a book on the live music scene in Toronto in the 1950s and 60s. It's actually a two-part, and starting with talking about Yorkville. Now, Oscar, to my knowledge, did not play in Yorkville, but he did play a lot at the Town Tavern, which was a landmark jazz club on Queen Street on the north side, just east of Yonge Street, and that was a kind of second home for him. And he, Toronto also afforded easy access to uh, Toronto afforded easy access to by air to various American cities and European cities where Oscar would often go on tour. And he spent a lot of time doing concerts in different places. And so I think that was also a factor. And finally, he would found a pioneering jazz school in Toronto at Park Road, at 21 Park Road, I believe. The building is still there, and you can actually walk by there and see a plaque that commemorates the School for Contemporary Music, that the Advanced School for Contemporary Music that he founded there, and in which he instructed along with Phil Nimmons, Ray Brown, and Ed Thigpen. And this was really quite a pioneering initiative to have a school where you could actually learn how to play modern jazz. And there wasn't really anything of that type in Canada, and only the beginnings of a formal jazz pedagogy in the United States. So, and that's, as I say in the lecture, I think that his work as an educator was especially important in as far as his legacy goes, which addresses a later question that I'm going to hit a little bit later on. So that would be my, I think the three factors there, at least three factors for him moving to Toronto rather than staying in. Oh, and I would add as well that Toronto was the center, is still the center of Canadian media, especially television and radio. And so, he often appeared on radio and on television. And there's a question about my own experience with Oscar Peterson's music. And my first memories of Oscar Peterson is seeing him on television. It seemed like he was always on TV. And so that, I think that was important too, that he had easy access to those channels that were so important in his career. Now here's kind of a tough question. Is there anything quintessentially Canadian about Oscar Peterson's sound or musical approach? Do you think that his music would have been different in any meaningful way if he had grown up in, say, Philadelphia or Boston rather than Montreal? The question of a Canadian sound is one that plagues just about anybody who tries to talk about Canadian musicians. Is there a Canadian sound? Is there a Canadian sound in rock music? Does Neil Young sound Canadian? And what does that mean to sound Canadian? What would it mean for Oscar Peterson to sound Canadian? I don't think that I've ever seen an acceptable definition of musical Canadianism. And that becomes an especially thorny problem if we're trying to identify it in the music of someone who plays jazz, which is such a quintessentially American form. That's not to say that only Americans can play music, or play jazz music, but that jazz, the language of jazz, was unmistakably formed in the United States. And exacerbating this problem is the fact that Oscar was so early in his career part of the American industry, that he was signed with an American record company. He toured with an American concert promoter, Norman Granz, and he often worked with American musicians and played, and so I have to say, as much as I would have loved to say that I believe that there is something Canadian or even Montreal about his playing, I can't honestly identify anything in that way. So I think that he was absolutely part of the mainstream of jazz. He happened to be Canadian. He chose to live here, which is important, and he had a big influence on the Canadian scene. But I don't know that I hear anything Canadian. And I don't even know that I believe in a identifiably uh, Canadian sound, as much as I hate to say that. All right. So a question. Here's another question. Uh, I'm curious about your own relationship with Oscar Peterson's music. When did you first encounter it, and what were your initial impressions, and how has your relationship with his music evolved over time? Well, as I mentioned, I first saw Oscar Peterson on television, and he would have been playing with one of his trios. This would have been in the uh, early 80s or late 70s, I would say. And my what I remember about my initial impressions was that he was an unbelievably skilled piano player. And when I was first starting as a musician myself, when I was 12 or 13, the thing that impressed me most was speed. So when I heard a musician, especially a jazz musician, who could really, as the kids say, shred on their instrument, I was mightily impressed. And well, Oscar could certainly shred. And the I remember one of the things that really amazed me about his abilities was how he seemed to have equal facility with both his left and his right hand. And it's, it's common in jazz piano for the left hand to block out chords or bass lines and basically, play kind of the rhythm section to the right hand, which is the solo. That's really where the show happens. And so you often, what you're used to hearing is kind of chords getting blocked out here and there in the left hand, and often very sparsely in modern jazz piano playing. And then the left hand is the one that's kind of flying and playing the solo. Well, very often Oscar would play synchronized runs in his left and right hands, and that really spoke to how thoroughly his technique was developed. So anyway, I remember as a young musician being really dazzled by him, and I actually saw him play on the revolving stage at the Ontario Place Forum in, I'm gonna say, 86, maybe 87, with Joe Pass, who was my favorite guitar player and still is probably my favorite guitar player. And of course, it was incredible. Later on, when I felt myself to be a more sophisticated music listener and a more sophisticated musician, I joined some of Oscar's critics in feeling that his piano style was rather glib, or rather, maybe technical in a way that took away from the emotion or the depth of his music. That it was just sort of a lot of technical display. And then after that, again, I came back to, I hope, a more balanced view of his music and a more mature view of his music. That rather than dismissing him because of his technique, that I see his technique as that it was a conduit to his musicality, and that his musicality was just stupendous. And he happened to have an extremely fluid ability to express that musicality. And also, I think I was critical, especially when I was in jazz college, because we were all about, well, this musician is an innovator, or this musician is unique. This musician breaks down the language of jazz and reconstructs it in their image. That whole modernist obsession with innovation. And as I say in the talk posted on the Hot Docs website, I don't think he was an innovator, and that's not really the point. I think that he was a classicist, and I think that has great value. And so I think I was critical maybe at a time about that, and I've come around to that. Oh, and by the way, I remembered that that possibly my first exposure to Oscar Peterson, and people I've spoken to, nobody remembers this, but maybe somebody who's watching now remembers it. There was a commercial, TV commercial for Coffee Mate, and Oscar played and sang in that commercial, and uh, the song went, "Coffee Mate tastes great. Coffee Mate is made just for coffee, so let Coffee Mate make your cup of coffee taste great." Anybody? No? I might just be older than everyone, and I'm the only one who remembers. But anyway, I remember that because he sang too, and I rarely heard him sing. Anyways, that's my personal history with Oscar in a nutshell. Okay, another question. What do you make of the Canadian jazz scene in general? How has it changed since Oscar's days? Uh, well, we've seen a huge contraction in live. The jazz scene in general, I think, has gotten smaller in a way in that there are fewer live jazz venues than there were then. And Oscar cut his teeth in the lounge scene in Montreal at a time when every restaurant that was worth their salt had a lounge with a piano. And there was a ton of work for musicians, especially pianists, and every place had a piano that was often in tune. And so that those days are largely gone. However, there are more. It seems like there's more jazz musicians than ever, largely because there is a huge educational infrastructure now for jazz. And so you've got all these players. Often they don't have a place to play, unfortunately, but they make a lot of recordings. And so, look, I think jazz is very healthy right now, in a way, but it's not maybe the same on a mainstream kind of club level that it once was. Uh, and so, it's a very different scene, I think, in short, from what Oscar grew up with. So, another question. If you're new to Oscar's music, where is the best place to begin? Any definitive albums or recordings to check out? I would say Night Train, On the Town, which is his live album at the Town Tavern in Toronto, the Canadiana Suite, which is all original Oscar music. Another one that's a real favorite is We Get Requests. And finally, a jazz portrait of Frank Sinatra. So those five would be big on my list. I see that we're running out of time, so I'll just hit this last question quickly. What is Oscar Peterson's lasting musical legacy? I think that he set an example of discipline and musical excellence for jazz musicians, that he inspired people through his recordings and concerts. And I think, and as I say in the talk, I think his work as an educator was extremely important, especially on the Canadian jazz scene, that he mentored these great young Canadian musicians and helped to set them on the right path. So that mentorship, his work as an educator, and so on, is his greatest lasting musical legacy. And I think that takes us to the end of our allotted time. So I want to thank you for joining us. We have as I mentioned, the folk course is open for my course on the folk revival is open for registration on the Hot Docs website. So I hope you'll join me there. And again, thank you everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next time.